one are you seeing?
You're like on slide. You got slide 1. You got slide 2 smaller up beside it.
What happened?
You need to hit the presentation mode board.
We're just gonna go with this setup till I figure it out.
That'll be fine.
All right.
That'll work. Okay. So, Citizenship of the Nation Merit Badge. Next slide.
I was gonna like do something. I'm gonna stay on because I'm SBL.
Okay.
I was gonna like do something else.
So mute that. It's important that we know who we are as a nation, and know what our rights are as citizens. And so, as you grow older, the skills that you get in this merit badge will stick with you and help you be a better citizen in our country. So, Boy Scouts wants everybody to have that skill set. That's why this is Eagle required. Next slide. Okay, so there's 8 requirements for this merit badge. You see 5 of those are in green and 3 of them are in red. The green ones we actually do during the class, and the red ones you're going to have to do on your own. When we get to the speech, you guys are going to be giving the speeches next week during the breakout. So we're going to try to get through the first 5 items today, and plus or minus. Okay, so next. Okay, so what does citizenship of the nation mean? We have rights, duties, and obligations as citizens. Next slide. Okay, so here are duties and obligations. We have to respect everybody. You don't have to agree with everybody, but you have to respect and listen to their opinion. Sometimes people might convince you that their opinion is the right one and yours is wrong. That's why we debate things civilly in our country. We obey the law. If we disagree with the law, we lobby our congressman to change the law. But the law is the law and we follow it. We pay our taxes, stay informed. That's particularly important now with the national health emergency. You need to know what's going on so that you do what the government tells you to do. Later on, you'll register for selective service and be available to protect other people who can't protect themselves. Next. Okay, our rights were found in the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And we learned from our other foundational document, the Declaration of Independence, that we get those rights from God, not from the government. The government is a way to ensure that we get to retain those rights. Next slide, please. Okay, if you went to Fort Benning, that's a federal facility. A National Historic Landmark could be Kennesaw Mountain or the General. Another federal facility could be the Mint down, or not the Mint, the Federal Reserve downtown, or Dobbins Air Reserve Base. You can go online with your parents' permission and find a national monument and write about it. But my expectation is in each of these blocks on your Citizenship of the Nation chart, you write in what that requirement is. And what we'll do is when we get back together, I'll review your packet to see that you filled it out. And if you filled it out, then we'll grant you the merit badge. Okay, next slide. So the first one, historic landmark. There's a national register. You can check, Google it based on location and find things close. But like I mentioned, Kennesaw Mountain's one that's easily accessible, and so is the General. Okay, next. And you have to do 2 of the 4 in A. You don't have to do all of them. So you go down to the Capitol, That's probably not happening during this point in time. But if you don't finish the merit badge and the government opens back up, you could go down to the Gold Dome and tour the Capitol, and that would fulfill requirement 2B. Next. Okay, the federal facility I mentioned, and if you did the Fort Benning trip, that was a federal facility. Okay, next. And this is where you would go online and find a national monument. That's like Mount Rushmore, or a lot of them are out west. Some of them are in the National Capital Region. Okay, next. So normally when I do this in a classroom, I have people try to figure out what the buildings are. So in the upper left is the White House. In the upper right is the U.S. Capitol building. In the lower right is the Jefferson Memorial. And on the lower left is the Washington Monument. Okay, those are all in the National Capital. Okay, next. Okay, so on the upper left there, that'll be the Eternal Flame. It's in Arlington National Cemetery. You got another view of the Jefferson Memorial in the upper right. In the lower right, that's the statue that looks upon the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall. And in the lower left is the National Air and Space Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian. Okay, next. Okay, so you watch the news for 5 days. This is something you're going to have to do on your own. If you would rather, you could go online and check the front page of a newspaper. The idea here is you know what's going on in the news, find something that affects your family, and it could be the basis for what you do in requirement 8, which requires you to write a letter to your congressman or senator. Okay? And we'll get to who the congressmen and senators are next week. So watch the news, and you'll have that done by next week. Next slide, please. Okay, so requirement 4 is a long one. We're going to discuss these documents. Next slide. Okay, highlighted in blue there is probably the most important part of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving from their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever a form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. Now, one of the things our forefathers were trying to do was saying, King George III, you're not governing us properly. We can govern ourselves better. And they declare their independence. And the whole document lists a litany of things that the English government had done to not be good for our forefathers. The most important thing, though, in this passage is that, one, those rights are given to you by God, and that the government is there to secure those for you. So the government doesn't give you the rights, they just guarantee those rights. Next slide. Okay, so these next few slides are the whole Declaration, right? I've highlighted in yellow a couple of things that you're going to see later. So this administration of justice, for example, you'll see that in the Constitution during the Bill of Rights, right? So some of the things that are found in the Bill of Rights first raise their head in the Declaration. Next slide. Okay, quartering troops, that ends up being an amendment. Trial by jury ends up being an amendment. These are all in the Bill of Rights. Next slide. Okay, and in the First Amendment, a lot of people forget that one of our rights is that we have the right to petition the government. And so I highlighted in blue in the very bottom, when you take your oath as the Eagle Scout, one of the things you do is you pledge your sacred honor. Okay? That's what our forefathers did when they signed the Declaration of Independence. They signed it based on their sacred honor. They committed themselves wholly to that. And eventually, when you're an Eagle Scout, you're going to commit yourself to trying to do your very best every day. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the reason why this says requirement 4 and 5 is the preamble of the Constitution was written because people's reading skills back then were not that great, and people didn't read a lot. So the fathers said, let's put everything that the Constitution is going to stand for in the preamble. And so the preamble tells us what the 6 functions of government are. So if you skip forward in your worksheets to requirement 5, it says list the function on the left side of the sheet. If you printed it out, this is probably on like page 8. It'll list the function, and then later on, what you're going to do is you're going to write how that function of government affects you and your family, okay, the local community. So the first function of government is in order to form a more perfect union. Then it's establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and the final one is secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. So that's why they established the Constitution, to do those 6 things. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what does the Constitution do? After we did the preamble, the actual body of the Constitution tells everyone, how are we going to do those 6 things? So how are we going to govern? Well, popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, both between the three areas. The first, Article 1, will deal with the legislative branch, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives. Article 2 deals with the executive branch, which is the president, but it also is all of the departments. So the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, all of those are part of the executive branch. And then the third is the courts, not just the Supreme Courts, but there are things called the Article 3 courts. That's your district courts and your courts of appeals. And then the fourth is dealings amongst states. The other separation of powers that we have in this country is we have the federal government, which has a certain role in governing, and then we have state and local governments, which have a role in governing. So you have a separation of powers between the branches and also between the state and the national government. Called federalism, so we have the federal government, which isn't a total power. It's split between the federal and the state. Okay. Next. Okay. First 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights. Next. Okay, next. Okay, the Bill of Rights were added because a lot of the states didn't want to ratify the Constitution unless rights were guaranteed to the people. So they added 10 amendments to the Constitution before it was ratified. In the First Amendment, we see 5 of those rights laid out: the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the right to assemble, and the right to petition government. So those rights are there based on the First Amendment. We hear that a lot: freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But if you read that, is a government isn't going to establish a national religion. It gives us the freedom to practice whichever religion we so desire. Can't be dictated on us. Okay, next, please. Amendment 2 is the right to bear arms. Now, this amendment is interpreted a couple of different ways. One is that everyone has the right to serve in the military, and another one is everyone's allowed to have whatever gun they want in their house. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Supreme Court has not really ruled definitively on what it means. The National Guard cites this amendment as the basis for why they are allowed to exist. And there's a lot of litigation that always goes on over this because it's a balance between an individual's right and the public safety. And remember, your right ends when it inflicts harm or takes another person's right away. Next slide. So if we remember back to the Declaration, soldiers can't be quartered. What happened was, prior to the Revolutionary War, British soldiers were being, come up to a house and say, hey, these 3 soldiers are going to live with you, and you're going to give them a bed to sleep in, and you're going to feed them. And people didn't like that. So they made sure that they put this in, that the government can't do that to you. So what the Constitution and the amendments do is say this is what the government can and cannot do to you, and based on the Third Amendment, they can't tell you that you have to house a soldier. Next slide. Okay, the Fourth Amendment is often referred to as the right to privacy. It protects you from illegal searches and seizures. So you've probably seen TV shows where they ask for a search warrant. That's because they have to have probable cause to come in and look for something. They can't, a policeman or a soldier or an FBI agent can't just walk into your house and say, hey, I'm looking for this. They have to have a reason. There has to be a witness or something else. So you have a right to privacy based on the Fourth Amendment. Next slide, please. So if you see another television show and they're having a trial and the guy pleads the Fifth Amendment prevents you from self-incrimination. You can't be forced to testify against yourself. There's a lot of other things in this amendment too, if you read it. But the bottom line is it's about due process. You have a right to maintain your life, liberty, and property. Okay, next. So the Sixth, and what I look at is the Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments are all, and the Eighth to some extent, they're all dealing with what happens when you come up against the law, right? The Sixth gives you the right to a speedy and public trial. In other words, you can't just be clapped in irons and thrown in jail. You have a right to have a trial, and that can be a trial by judge or a trial by jury, but you get a trial. You can't just be accused and thrown in jail. Next slide. So the Seventh Amendment gives you the right to trial by jury, and there was a dollar amount back in 1787 that they affixed to that. Bottom line is, if you want to be tried by a jury of your peers, you are allowed to be tried by a jury of your peers. Can't just be a judge or a magistrate. You have a right to request that. You can waive any of your rights, however. Sometimes it's better to be tried by a judge than by a jury. Next slide. Okay, so this is an interesting amendment. Excessive bail shall not be required. Well, if I've got billions of dollars like Michael Bloomberg, $100,000 might not be excessive, but for you and me, that would be. So what excessive bail means is based on the individual. There's a fight going on in New York State right now because they waived all rights to bail, and so what's happening is people are being arrested and not even going to jail for things like robbery because they have no bail. So you got to have some. So cruel and unusual punishment is another issue. What is cruel and unusual? Hard to say. What was normal back in 1800 may not be normal now. And the big thing there is the death penalty cruel and unusual, and that is continually percolating through the courts for the Supreme Court to eventually decide on. Next slide, please. Okay, I like the Ninth Amendment. What it says is, just because it doesn't say you can or can't in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have it. So you have every right in the world unless you have given that right up to the government, either through the U.S. Constitution or the Constitution of our state. So you have a right for everything unless somewhere in the law it says otherwise. So if it doesn't say you can't, you can. That's what the Ninth Amendment says. The 10th Amendment, next slide, says if it's not in the Constitution, the federal government can't do that to us. So anything that isn't specified in the U.S. Constitution, the states take care of. Now, there's a little wedge in the Constitution when you look at it, where the federal government is allowed to help with commerce and promote the general welfare, and those little wedges are how the federal government ends up making laws and doing things beyond the specified scope of the Constitution, because it's been adjudicated through the Supreme Court that those things either promote commerce or the general welfare. So those two clauses are brought up quite often in litigation, but if you watch the court system, there's a lot of challenges to federal laws based on the 10th Amendment. Okay, next slide. Okay, the rest of the amendments. So you're going to have to write a little bit about each one. The 11th Amendment basically says if you sue a state, that doesn't mean you can sue the federal government. The states and the federal government are different, and states are sovereign. Up until 1804, the guy that took second place in a presidential election became the vice president. So if you can imagine, in our last presidential election, we had Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump running against each other. Regardless of who won, they would not have gotten along with their vice president. So that's really not a good plan. So the 12th Amendment fixed that by saying they run as a pair. Okay. And then for 60 years, we didn't have any changes. And, kind of an ulcer on our nation was slavery. That's a bad thing. Most of Europe had done away with it, years before we did. And a lot of people think that the Emancipation Proclamation did away with slavery, but it didn't. What that did was it freed the slaves in areas that were in rebellion against the United States. It was an executive order. What freed the slaves was the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery and changed the Constitution. Prior to that, there's articles in the Constitution that basically validate slavery. So the 14th Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th are looked at as the Reconstruction Amendments. Okay, the 14th specifies rules on Reconstruction. So what's going to happen in the South as we try to bring the South back into the Union, and how are we going to treat people? It had to be a federal amendment because there was nothing in the Constitution that said how they're going to do that. And because of the 10th Amendment, they didn't have the right to do it unless it was in the Constitution. So they had to pass the amendment to do Reconstruction. And then during Reconstruction, the freedmen were having their rights abused, particularly by the Ku Klux Klan. And some of the Southern state leadership were denying the rights to vote based on race. And so to make sure that people were not denied their rights because of their race or previous condition of servitude, the 15th Amendment was passed basically to reinforce the 13th Amendment. Okay, so we go 40 years more, and we get to the 16th Amendment. Prior to 1913, the federal government was principally funded by tariffs. So trade would come in or out of our ports, and we would tax it, and that money would provide the funding for the government. Well, tariffs had a negative effect on commerce, and so it was decided that instead of relying solely on tariffs and to increase the amount of money that the government got, they passed the income tax. Without that, remember, the initial Constitution doesn't grant the federal government that right, so we had to give up that right for the federal government to have money to pay for things. Also that year, we passed the 17th Amendment. Now, prior to the 17th Amendment, state legislatures would elect the senators. So it'd be like Senator Kirkpatrick, which is my state senator, would actually, with the other state senators, vote for who would become the federal senator that would go up to Washington. Right now, our senators are Mr. Perdue and Ms. Loeffler, but they were elected by popular vote because of this amendment. In the past, it would be our state senators that did it. So what this did is reduced the importance of state government and increased your individual right to elect someone. Okay, 18th Amendment. In 1919, they passed prohibition, so that outlawed alcoholic beverages. The temperance movement and the women's suffrage movement were closely aligned, and you can see that right after prohibition was passed, women's suffrage was passed. Now, suffrage does not mean that someone is suffering. It means someone has the right to vote. So in 1920, women were finally given the right to vote. Interestingly enough, some of the western states like Wyoming, women had the right to vote back in the 1880s when they became states. So we're kind of behind the times on that. Okay, it wasn't until 1933 that we actually said that the vice president succeeds the president. Oh, it had happened several times, but it codified that. It also said that Congress' term begins on the 3rd of January and that the president gets sworn in on the 20th of January. Prior to that, it was kind of like pick a date and agree upon it. So that actually gave us more structure on a smooth transition of government from one administration to the next. The 21st Amendment ended 14 years of gangland crime, so they repealed prohibition. So we put something in, it didn't work, we took it out. So the Constitution is a living document only in the terms of amendments can be added and repealed. Okay. Franklin Roosevelt had 4 terms as president. He was elected, took us through the Depression, and on the eve of World War II in 1940, he sought and was elected to a 3rd term. Okay, and then in 44, he had a 4th term that he was elected to, and then he died in office. People thought that that was too much. George Washington had established a tradition that after 2 terms he stepped down, and people said, well, 2 terms was good enough for George Washington, 2 terms should be enough for anybody, and they passed an amendment to make sure that we'd have that. The idea being, if someone served more than 2 terms, they might turn into a dictator. And they didn't want to have that. Okay. In 1961, the District of Columbia finally got the chance to vote for president. We use the Electoral College, which means every state gets 1 vote for president for each senator, so 2 per state, plus an additional vote for every representative. Well, Washington, D.C. doesn't have any senators, and it has a non-voting member of Congress who doesn't count as a congressman. So they had no vote. So that's taxation without representation, and that's not right. So D.C., based on the 23rd Amendment, gets the same number of electoral votes as the smallest state. So that's always going to be 3. Okay. Then we get to, in 1964, the poll tax. Mainly in southern states, the states were charging a tax. In other words, hey, yeah, you can go and vote in the election, but it's going to cost you $20 or $50 or whatever. Well, that's not right, because just because you don't have the money to pay for going in to vote doesn't mean you shouldn't vote and that your voice doesn't count. So they had to pass the amendment because it didn't say in the Constitution that you couldn't do that. So they had to put it in there to keep in line and make sure that people had the right to vote. Okay. Presidential succession, they had an issue when President Kennedy was shot and assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson took over for him. And it took a couple years to pass this amendment, but the concern was, what happens if the president has a stroke or gets shot and he doesn't die? He's still the president, and who's in charge? Well, the 25th Amendment says if the president is incapacitated, and that's determined by a majority vote of the cabinet, if they say, the president is incapacitated, he can't do his duties, then the vice president is going to take over. And it also stipulates that after the vice president, the next one in line is the Speaker of the House. So it lines out who's next in line for each thing. The 60s were a really turbulent time in our nation. The draft to send people to the Vietnam War was very, very unpopular. And the argument was, if you could get drafted at age 18, you should have the right to vote so that your vote would matter. So that's why the right to vote was put in for 18-year-olds. Now, I expect you guys, when you turn 18, to vote, because 18-year-olds are still the lowest percentage of turnout in national elections. So if you have that right, you should exercise it. If you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain. And then the last amendment that's passed was the 27th. What it says is Congress can't vote itself a pay raise. But it's misleading, because the people that are in Congress now, they can vote a pay raise, but it doesn't take effect until after the next election. So since 80% of them get reelected, they actually still could vote themselves a pay raise. But they have to, if they vote themselves a big pay raise, they got to go pass a reelection campaign before that. Okay, so that's all the amendments, and I know that was long. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about the 6 functions of government a little bit. Those are in the preamble. They're listed there again. So if you look at your worksheet, those 6 functions go in the box on the left side of the page. And then in the right side of the page, I want you to fill that block on how those functions affect you, your family, and the local community. And if it's just you or your family or the community, whatever, or all 3. But I want you to think about those functions of government and what they mean to you. Okay, next. So the first one, and when you pull this up, you'll get a lot of this. We the people. We are what gives the government power, because we've ceded some of our rights to the government. Next. Okay, we had the Articles of Confederation before we had the current Constitution. In 1783, we were going to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, modify them, amend them a little bit. And that's what the Constitutional Convention was supposed to be. But the Founding Fathers said, you know what? The Articles of Confederation are fatally flawed. It's an imperfect union, so we're going to have this Constitution make it more perfect. So that's why it says a more perfect union. Next. Okay. So the Constitution establishes it under Article 3, establishes the court system to establish justice. Next. Okay. So tranquility does not just mean the absence of war. It means that we have harmony, that the businesses can thrive, that people can go about their business and have pursue happiness. So right now we don't have a lot of domestic tranquility because we have a national health emergency, but our government is trying to establish domestic tranquility, so they're working toward that end. Okay, next please. Provide for common defense. One of the most important things the government does is have the military prevent foreign invasion. We needed a stronger central government to do that. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states got to decide how much they wanted to support the federal military. But this, the reason why the president is called the commander-in-chief, because he's in charge of the military. So that gives us a stronger central government so that we can have an effective military to protect us. Next, please. Okay, I've highlighted on the left side, promote. Okay, the government can't legislate things about the general welfare, but they can promote it. And how they promote it is by giving money, kickbacks, for things like education, or are you going to support the federal desires for this or that? The most recent thing that happened was you hear a lot about sanctuary cities, and there was a law that some states passed saying, hey, we're going to do this. And the federal government said, okay, well, if you have sanctuary cities, we're not going to give you money for law enforcement. And they sued the federal government over it, and the Supreme Court said, well, they can promote the general welfare by not giving you the money if you're not supporting the federal desires, because it's federal money, federal desires. So that was the most recent court case. It was a couple of weeks ago. Congress still can't pass laws saying, hey, this would be a good thing. They can only promote it. Okay, next slide. Okay. That's what I have for this week. Requirement 6 is something that you're going to do over this week and present next week. There are several speeches of national importance. On the next slide, I've got examples of some. Okay, so you got a number of people here that had important speeches, right? And what I'm looking for is, you got to find out about the author. So if you were doing the Gettysburg Address, for example, who was Abraham Lincoln? Okay. Why was the speech important at the time? And how does the stuff that was in that speech, why is that still important today? And a line or two that's important to you. So for me, going down there, I'm looking at Douglas MacArthur, okay, the duty, honor, country speech. And he said, duty, honor, country, those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be. They are your rallying points to build courage when courage seems to fail, regain faith when there's little cause for faith, and create hope when hope becomes forlorn. Pretty important when guys are under fire, important in times of crisis, and it kind of give us touchstones as scouts, because there's a lot of tie-ins to the scout law there. So he was general of the armies, and sometimes referred to as American Caesar. Spent 40 years protecting the nation in the Pacific. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm looking for when you do that. Okay, and then we'll do the other requirements after your speeches next week. So Rudy, that's what I've got for today. We'll do the last bit after the speeches next week.
Sounds good. All right, so stopping the sharing. I'm going to stop the recording.